Anybody who really wishes to talk simple truth about money at the present time is confronted by a very serious practical difficulty. He must put himself in opposition to the overwhelming body of public opinion and resign himself to being regarded either as a poseur, a crank, or a fool. The public is in search of happiness now as it was 1,000,000 years ago. Money is not the principal factor in happiness. It may be argued whether, as a factor in happiness, money is of 20th-rate importance or 50th-rate importance, but it cannot be argued whether money, in point of fact, does or does not of itself bring happiness. There can be no doubt whatever that money does not bring happiness. Yet, in face of this incontrovertible and universal truth, the whole public behaves exactly as if money were the sole or the principal preliminary to happiness. The public does not reason, and it will not listen to reason. Its blood is up in the money hunt, and the philosopher might as well expostulate with an earthquake as try to take that public by the buttonhole and explain. If a man sacrifices his interest under the will of some dead social tyrant in order to marry whom he wishes, if an English minister of religion declines $25,000 a year to go into exile and preach to New York millionaires, the phenomenon is genuinely held to be so astounding that it at once flies right round the world in the form of exclamatory newspaper articles. In an age when such an attitude towards money is sincere, it is positively dangerous, I doubt if it may not be harmful, to persist with loud obstinacy that money, instead of being the greatest, is the least thing in the world. In times of high military excitement, a man may be ostracized, if not lynched, for uttering opinions which everybody will accept as truisms a couple of years later. And thus the wise philosopher holds his tongue, lest it should be cut out. So at the zenith of a period when the possession of money in absurd masses is an infallible means to the general respect, I have no intention either of preaching or of practicing quite all that I privately believe in the matter of riches. It was not always thus. Though there have been previous ages as lustful for wealth and ostentation as our own, there have also been ages when money-getting and millionaire envying were not the sole preoccupations of the average man. And such an age will undoubtedly succeed to ours. Few things would surprise me less in social life than the upspringing of some anti-luxury movement, the formation of some league or guild among the middling classes, where alone intellect is to be found in quantity, the members of which would bind themselves to stand aloof from all the great, silly, banal, ugly and tedious luxe activities of the time, and not to spend more than a certain sum per annum on eating, drinking, covering their bodies, and being moved about like parcels from one spot of the earth's surface to another. Such a movement would, and will, help towards the formation of an opinion which would condemn lavish expenditure on personal satisfactions as bad form. However, the shareholders of grand hotels, restaurants and racecourses of all sorts, together with popular singers and barristers, etc., need feel no immediate alarm. The movement is not yet. As touching the effect of money on the efficient ordering of the human machine, there is happily no necessity to inform those who have begun to interest themselves in the conduct of their own brains that money counts for very little in that paramount affair. Nothing that really helps towards perfection costs more than is within the means of every person who reads these pages. The expenses connected with daily meditation, with the building up of mental habits, with the practice of self-control and of cheerfulness, with the enthronement of reason over the rabble of primeval instincts, these expenses are really, trifling. And whether you get that well-deserved rise of £1 a week, or whether you don't, you may anyhow go ahead with the machine. It isn't a motor car, though I started by comparing it to one. And even when, having to a certain extent mastered, through sensible management of the machine, the art of achieving a daily content and dignity, you come to the embroidery of life, even the best embroidery of life is not absolutely ruinous. Meat may go up in price, it has done, but books won't. Admission to picture galleries and concerts and so forth will remain quite low. The views from Richmond Hill or Hindhead or along Pall Mall at sunset, the smell of the earth, the taste of fruit and of kisses, these things are unaffected by the machinations of trusts and the hysteria of stock exchanges. Travel, which after books is the finest of all embroideries, and which is not to be valued by the mile but by the quality, is decidedly cheaper than ever it was. All that is required is ingenuity in one's expenditure, and much ingenuity with a little money is vastly more profitable and amusing than much money without ingenuity. And all the while as you read this, you are saying with your impatient sneer, "It's all very well, it's all very fine talking, but..." In brief, you are not convinced. You cannot deracinate that wide-rooted dogma within your soul that more money means more joy. I regret it. But let me put one question, and let me ask you to answer it honestly. Your financial means are greater now than they used to be. Are you happier or less discontented than you used to be? Taking your existence day by day, hour by hour, judging it by the mysterious feel in the chest of responsibilities, worries, positive joys and satisfactions, are you genuinely happier than you used to be? I do not wish to be misunderstood. The financial question cannot be ignored. If it is true that money does not bring happiness, it is no less true that the lack of money induces a state of affairs in which efficient living becomes doubly difficult. These two propositions, superficially perhaps self-contradictory, are not really so. A modest income suffices for the fullest realization of the ego in terms of content and dignity, but you must live within it. You cannot righteously ignore money. A man, for instance, who cultivates himself and instructs a family of daughters in everything except the ability to earn their own livelihood, and then has the impudence to die suddenly without leaving a penny, that man is a scoundrel. 90, or should I say 99% of all those anxieties which render proper living almost impossible are caused by the habit of walking on the edge of one's income, as one might walk on the edge of a precipice. The majority of Englishmen have some financial worry or other continually, everlastingly at the back of their minds. The sacrifice necessary to abolish this condition of things is more apparent than real. All spending is a matter of habit. Speaking generally, a man can contrive, out of an extremely modest income, to have all that he needs, unless he needs the esteem of snobs. Habit may, and habit usually does, make it just as difficult to keep a family on 2,000 a year as on 200. I suppose that for the majority of men, the suspension of income for a single month would mean either bankruptcy, the usurer, or acute inconvenience. Impossible under such circumstances to be in full and independent possession of one's immortal soul. Hence, I should be inclined to say that the first preliminary to a proper control of the machine is the habit of spending decidedly less than one earns or receives. The veriest automaton of a clerk ought to have the wherewithal of a whole year as a shield against the caprices of his employer. It would be as reasonable to expect the inhabitants of an unfortified city in the midst of a plain occupied by a hostile army to apply themselves successfully to the study of logarithms or metaphysics, as to expect a man without a year's income in his safe to apply himself successfully to the true art of living. And the whole secret of relative freedom from financial anxiety lies not in income, but in expenditure. I am ashamed to utter this antique platitude, but like most aphorisms of unassailable wisdom, it is completely ignored. You say, of course, that it is not easy to leave a margin between your expenditure and your present income. I know it. I fraternally shake your hand. Still, it is, in most cases, far easier to lessen one's expenditure than to increase one's income without increasing one's expenditure. The alternative is before you. However you decide, be assured that the foundation of philosophy is a margin, and that the margin can always be had. End of chapter 15. I now come to an entirely different aspect of the whole subject. Hitherto I have dealt with the human machine as a contrivance for adapting the man to his environment. My aim has been to show how much depends on the machine and how little depends on the environment, and that the essential business of the machine is to utilize, for making the stuff of life, the particular environment in which it happens to find itself, and no other. All this, however, does not imply that one must accept, fatalistically and permanently and passively, any preposterous environment into which destiny has chanced to throw us. If we carry far enough the discipline of our brains, we can, no doubt, arrive at surprisingly good results in no matter what environment. But it would not be right reason to expend an excessive amount of willpower on brain discipline when a slighter effort in a different direction would produce consequences more felicitous. A man whom fate had pitched into a canal might accomplish miracles in the way of rendering himself amphibian. He might stagger the world by the spectacle of his philosophy under amazing difficulties. People might pay sixpence a head to come and see him, but he would be less of a nincompoop if he climbed out and arranged to live definitely on the bank. The advantage of an adequate study of the control of the machine, such as I have outlined, is that it enables the student to judge with some certainty whether the unsatisfactoriness of his life is caused by a disordered machine or by an environment for which the machine is, in its fundamental construction, unsuitable. It does help him to decide justly whether, in the case of a grave difference between them, he or the rest of the universe is in the wrong. And also, if he decides that he is not in the wrong, it helps him to choose a new environment or to modify the old upon some scientific principle. The vast majority of people never know with any precision why they are dissatisfied with their sojourn on this planet. They make long and fatiguing excursions in search of precious materials which all the while are concealed in their own breasts. They don't know what they want. They only know that they want something. Or, if they contrive to settle in their own minds what they do want, 100 to 1, the obtaining of it will leave them just as far off contentment as they were at the beginning. This is a matter of daily observation, that people are frantically engaged in attempting to get hold of things which, by universal experience, are hideously disappointing to those who have obtained possession of them. And still the struggle goes on, and probably will go on. All because brains are lying idle. It is no trifle that is at stake, said Epictetus as to the question of control of instinct by reason. It means, are you in your senses, or are you not? In this significance, indubitably, the vast majority of people are not in their senses. Otherwise they would not behave as they do, so vaguely, so happy-go-luckily, so blindly. But the man whose brain is in working order emphatically is in his senses. And when a man, by means of the efficiency of his brain, has put his reason in definite command over his instincts, he at once sees things in a truer perspective than was before possible, and therefore he is able to set a just value upon the various parts which go to make up his environment. If, for instance, he lives in London and is aware of constant friction, he will be led to examine the claims of London as a mecca for intelligent persons. He may say to himself, there is something wrong, and the seat of trouble is not in the machine. London compels me to tolerate dirt, darkness, ugliness, strain, tedious daily journeyings, and general expensiveness. What does London give me in exchange? And he may decide that as London offers him nothing special in exchange, except the glamour of London and an occasional seat at a good concert or a bad play, he may get a better return for his expenditure of brains, nerves, and money in the provinces. He may perceive, with a certain French novelist, that most people of truly distinguished mind prefer the provinces. And he may then actually, in obedience to reason, quit the deceptions of London with a tranquil heart, sure of his diagnosis. Whereas a man who had not devoted much time to the care of his mental machinery could not screw himself up to the step, partly from lack of resolution, and partly because he had never examined the sources of his unhappiness. A man who, not having full control of his machine, is consistently dissatisfied with his existence, is like a man who is being secretly poisoned and cannot decide with what or by whom, and so he has no middle course between absolute starvation and a continuance of poisoning. As with the environment of place, so with the environment of individuals. Most friction between individuals is avoidable friction. Sometimes, however, friction springs from such deep causes that no skill in the machine can do away with it. But how is the man whose brain is not in command of his existence to judge whether the unpleasantness can be cured or not? Whether it arises in himself or in the other? He simply cannot judge. Whereas a man who keeps his brain for use and not for idle amusement will, when he sees that friction persists in spite of his brain, be so clearly impressed by the advisability of separation as the sole cure that he will steel himself to the effort necessary for a separation. One of the chief advantages of an efficient brain is that an efficient brain is capable of acting with firmness and resolution, partly, of course, because it has been toned up, but more because its operations are not confused by the interference of mere instincts. Thirdly, there is the environment of one's general purpose in life, which is, I feel convinced, far more often hopelessly wrong and futile than either the environment of situation or the environment of individuals. I will be bold enough to say that quite 70% of ambition is never realized at all, and that 99% of all realized ambition is fruitless. In other words, that a gigantic sacrifice of the present to the future is always going on. And here again the utility of brain discipline is most strikingly shown. A man whose first business it is every day to concentrate his mind on the proper performance of that particular day must necessarily conserve his interest in the present. It is impossible that his perspective should become so warped that he will devote, say, 55 years of his career to problematical preparations for his comfort and his glory during the final 10 years. A man whose brain is his servant, and not his lady help or his pet dog, will be in receipt of such daily content and satisfaction that he will early ask himself the question, As for this ambition that is eating away my hours, what will it give me that I have not already got? Further, the steady development of interest in the hobby, call it, of common sense daily living will act as an automatic test of any ambition. If an ambition survives and flourishes on the top of that daily cultivation of the machine, then the owner of the ambition may be sure that it is a genuine and an invincible ambition, and he may pursue it in full faith. His developed care for the present will prevent him from making his ambition an altar on which the whole of the present is to be offered up. I shall be told that I want to do away with ambition, and that ambition is the great motive power of existence, and that therefore I am an enemy of society and the truth is not in me. But I do not want to do away with ambition. What I say is that current ambitions usually result in disappointment, that they usually mean the complete distortion of a life. This is an incontestable fact, and the reason of it is that ambitions are chosen either without knowledge of their real value or without knowledge of what they will cost. A disciplined brain will at once show the unnecessariness of most ambitions, and will ensure that the remainder shall be conducted with reason. It will also convince its possessor that the ambition to live strictly according to the highest common sense during the next 24 hours is an ambition that needs a lot of beating. And that when experience has roughly corrected this impression, the said reader, unless he is most solemnly warned, may abandon the entire enterprise in a fit of disgust, and forever afterwards maintain a cynical and impolite attitude towards all theories of controlling the human machine. Now, the enterprise is not a simple one. It is based on one simple principle, the conscious discipline of the brain by selected habits of thought. But it is just about as complicated as anything well could be. Advanced golf is child's play compared to it. The man who briefly says to himself, I will get up at 8, and from 8:30 to 9 I will examine and control my brain, and so my life will at once be instantly improved out of recognition, that man is destined to unpleasant surprises. Progress will be slow. Progress may appear to be quite rapid at first, and then a period of futility may set in, and the would-be vanquisher of his brain may suffer a series of the most deadly defeats. And in his pessimism he may imagine that all his pains have gone for nothing, and that the unserious loungers in exhibition gardens and readers of novels in parlours are in the right of it after all. He may even feel rather ashamed of himself for having been, as he thinks, taken in by specious promises, like the purchaser of a quack medicine. The conviction that great effort has been made and no progress achieved is the chief of the dangers that affront the beginner in machine tending. It is, I will assert positively, in every case a conviction unjustified by the facts, and usually it is the mere result of reaction after fatigue, encouraged by the instinct for laziness. I do not think it will survive an impartial examination, but I know that a man, in order to find an excuse for abandoning further effort, is capable of convincing himself that past effort has yielded no fruit at all. So curious is the human machine. I beg every student of himself to consider this remark with all the intellectual honesty at his disposal. It is a grave warning. When the machine tender observes that he is frequently changing his point of view, when he notices that what he regarded as the kernel of the difficulty yesterday has sunk to a triviality today, being replaced by a fresh phenomenon, when he arises one morning and by means of a new, unexpected glimpse into the recesses of the machine perceives that hitherto he has been quite wrong and must begin again, when he wonders how on earth he could have been so blind and so stupid as not to see what now he sees, when the new vision is veiled by new disappointments and narrowed by continual reservations, when he is overwhelmed by the complexity of his undertaking, then let him enhearten himself, for he is succeeding. The history of success in any art, and machine tending is an art, is a history of recommencements, of the dispersal and reforming of doubts, of an ever-increasing conception of the extent of the territory unconquered, and an ever-decreasing conception of the extent of the territory conquered. It is remarkable that though no enterprise could possibly present more diverse and changeful excitement than the mastering of the brain, the second great danger which threatens its ultimate success is nothing but a mere drying up of enthusiasm for it. One would have thought that in an affair which concerned him so nearly, in an affair whose results might be in a very strict sense vital to him, in an affair upon which his happiness and misery might certainly turn, a man would not weary from sheer tedium. Nevertheless, it is so. Again and again I have noticed the abandonment, temporary or permanent, of this mighty and thrilling enterprise from simple lack of interest. And I imagine that in practically all cases, save those in which an exceptional original force of will renders the enterprise scarcely necessary, the interest in it will languish unless it is regularly nourished from without. Now, the interest in it cannot be nourished from without by means of conversation with other brain tamers. There are certain things which may not be discussed by sanely organized people, and this is one. The affair is too intimate, and it is also too moral. Even after only a few minutes' vocalization on this subject, a deadly infection seems to creep into the air, the infection of priggishness. Or am I mistaken, and do I fancy this horror? No, I cannot believe that I am mistaken. Hence, the nourishment must be obtained by reading, a little reading every day. I suppose there are some thousands of authors who have written with more or less sincerity on the management of the human machine, but the two which for me stand out easily above all the rest are Marcus Aurelius Antoninus and Epictetus. Not much has been discovered since their time. The perfecting of life is a power residing in the soul, wrote Marcus Aurelius in the 9th book of To Himself over 1700 years ago. Marcus Aurelius is assuredly regarded as the greatest of writers in the human machine school, and not to read him daily is considered by many to be a bad habit. As a confession, his work stands alone. But as a practical Bradshaw of existence, I would put the discourses of Epictetus before Marcus Aurelius. Epictetus is grosser. He will call you a blockhead as soon as look at you. He is witty, he is even humorous, and he never wanders far away from the incidents of daily life. He is brimming over with actuality for readers of the year 1908. He was a freed slave. Marcus Aurelius was an emperor, and he had the morbidity from which all emperors must suffer. A finer soul than Epictetus, he is not, in my view, so useful a companion. Not all of us can breathe freely in his atmosphere. Nevertheless, he is, of course, to be read and reread continually. When you have gone through Epictetus, a single page or paragraph per day, well masticated and digested, suffices. You can go through Marcus Aurelius, and then you can return to Epictetus, and so on, morning by morning or night by night, till your life's end, and they will conserve your interest in yourself. In the matter of concentration, I hesitate to recommend Mrs. Annie Besant's Thought Power, and yet I should be possibly unjust if I did not recommend it, having regard to its immense influence on myself. It is not one of the best books of this astounding woman. It is addressed to theosophists and can only be completely understood in the light of theosophistic doctrines. To grasp it all, I found myself obliged to study a much larger work dealing with theosophy as a whole. It contains an appreciable quantity of what strikes me as feeble sentimentalism, and also a lot of sheer dogma, but it is the least unsatisfactory manual of the brain that I have met with. And if the profane reader ignores all that is either Greek or twaddle to him, there will yet remain for his advantage a vast amount of very sound information and advice. All these 3 books are cheap. Chapter 2. Amateurs in the Art of Living. Considering that we have to spend the whole of our lives in this human machine, considering that it is our sole means of contact and compromise with the rest of the world, we really do devote to it very little attention. When I say we, I mean our inmost spirits, the instinctive part, the mystery within that exists. And when I say the human machine, I mean the brain and the body, and chiefly the brain. The expression of the soul by means of the brain and body is what we call the art of living. We certainly do not learn this art at school to any appreciable extent. At school we are taught that it is necessary to fling our arms and legs to and fro for so many hours per diem. We are also shown practically that our brains are capable of performing certain useful tricks, and that if we do not compel our brains to perform those tricks we shall suffer. Thus, one day we run home and proclaim to our delighted parents that 11 12s are 132, a feat of the brain. So it goes on until our parents begin to look up to us because we can chatter of cosines or sketch the foreign policy of Louis XIV. Good, but not a word about the principles of the art of living yet. Only a few detached rules from our parents to be blindly followed when particular crises supervene. And indeed it would be absurd to talk to a schoolboy about the expression of his soul. He would probably mutter a monosyllable which is not mice. Of course, school is merely a preparation for living, unless one goes to a university, in which case it is a preparation for university. One is supposed to turn one's attention to living when these preliminaries are over, say at the age of about 20. Assuredly, one lives then. There is, however, nothing new in that, for one has been living all the time in a fashion. All the time one has been using the machine without understanding it. But does one, school and college being over, enter upon a study of the machine? Not a bit. The question then becomes not how to live, but how to obtain and retain a position in which one will be able to live. How to get minute portions of dead animals and plants which one can swallow in order not to die of hunger. How to acquire and constantly renew a stock of other portions of dead animals and plants in which one can envelop oneself in order not to die of cold. How to procure the exclusive right of entry into certain huts where one may sleep and eat without being rained upon by the clouds of heaven, and so forth. And when one has realized this ambition, there comes the desire to be able to double the operation and do it not for oneself alone, but for oneself and another, marriage. But no scientific sustained attention is yet given to the real business of living, of smooth intercourse, of self-expression, of conscious adaptation to environment. in brief, to the study of the machine. At 30, the chances are that a man will understand better the draught of a chimney than his own respiratory apparatus, to name one of the simple, obvious things. And as for understanding the working of his own brain, what an idea! As for the skill to avoid the waste of power involved by friction in the business of living, do we give an hour to it in a month? Do we ever at all examine it, save in an amateurish and clumsy fashion? A young lady produces a watercolour drawing. Very nice, we say, and add to ourselves, for an amateur. But our living is more amateurish than that young lady's drawing, though surely we ought every one of us to be professionals at living. When we have been engaged in the preliminaries to living for about 55 years, we begin to think about slacking off. Up till this period, our reason for not having scientifically studied the art of living, the perfecting and use of the finer parts of the machine, is not that we have lacked leisure. Most of us have enormous heaps of leisure, but that we have simply been too absorbed in the preliminaries. Have, in fact, treated the preliminaries to the business as the business itself. Then at 55 we ought at last to begin to live our lives with professional skill, as a professional painter paints pictures. Yes, but we can't. It is too late then. Neither painters nor acrobats nor any professionals can be formed at the age of 55. Thus we finish our lives amateurishly, as we have begun them. And when the machine creaks and sets our teeth on edge, or refuses to obey the steering wheel and deposits us in the ditch, we say, "Can't be helped," or "Doesn't matter, it will all be the same 100 years hence," or "I must make the best of things." And we try to believe that in accepting the status quo, we have justified the status quo, and all the time we feel our insincerity. You exclaim that I exaggerate. I do. To force into prominence an aspect of affairs usually overlooked, it is absolutely necessary to exaggerate. Poetic license is one name for this kind of exaggeration, but I exaggerate very little indeed, much less than perhaps you think. I know that you are going to point out to me that vast numbers of people regularly spend a considerable portion of their leisure in striving after self-improvement. Granted, and I am glad of it, but I should be gladder if their strivings bore more closely upon the daily business of living, of self-expression without friction and without futile desires. See this man who regularly studies every evening of his life. He has genuinely understood the nature of poetry, and his taste is admirable. He recites verse with true feeling, and may be said to be highly cultivated. Poetry is a continual source of pleasure to him. True, but why is he always complaining about not receiving his deserts in the office? Why is he worried about finance? Why does he so often sulk with his wife? Why does he persist in eating more than his digestion will tolerate? It was not written in the book of fate that he should complain and worry and sulk and suffer. And if he was a professional at living, he would not do these things. There is no reason why he should do them, except the reason that he has never learnt his business, never studied the human machine as a whole, never really thought rationally about living. Supposing you encountered an automobilist who was swerving and grinding all over the road, and you stopped to ask what was the matter, and he replied, "Never mind what's the matter, just look at my lovely acetylene lamps, how they shine, and how I've polished them." You would not regard him as a Clifford Earp, or even as an entirely sane man. So with our student of poetry. It is indubitable that a large amount of what is known as self-improvement is simply self-indulgence, a form of pleasure which only incidentally improves a particular part of the machine, and even that to the neglect of far more important parts. My aim is to direct a man's attention to himself as a whole, considered as a machine, complex and capable of quite extraordinary efficiency. For 10 chapters you have stood it, but not without protest. I know the feeling which is in your minds, and which has manifested itself in numerous criticisms of my ideas. That feeling may be briefly translated perhaps thus: this is all very well, but it isn't true, not a bit. It's only a fairy tale that you have been telling us. Miracles don't happen, etc. I, on my part, have a feeling that unless I take your feeling in hand at once and firmly deal with it, I had better put my shutters up, for you will have got into the way of regarding me simply as a source of idle amusement. Already I can perceive from the expressions of some critics that, so far as they are concerned, I might just as well not have written a word. Therefore, at this point I pause, in order to insist once more upon what I began by saying. The burden of your criticism is, human nature is always the same. I know my faults, but it is useless to tell me about them. I can't alter them. I was born like that. The fatal weakness of this argument is, first, that it is based on a complete falsity, and second, that it puts you in an untenable position. Human nature does change. Nothing can be more unscientific, more hopelessly medieval, than to imagine that it does not. It changes like everything else. You can't see it change, true, but then you can't see the grass growing, not unless you arise very early. Is human nature the same now as in the days of Babylonian civilization, when the social machine was oiled by drenchings of blood? Is it the same now as in the days of Greek civilization, when there was no such thing as romantic love between the sexes? Is it the same now as it was during the centuries when constant friction had to provide its own cure in the shape of constant war? Is it the same now as it was on the 2nd of March 1819, when the British government officially opposed a motion to consider the severity of the criminal laws, which included capital punishment for cutting down a tree and other sensible dodges against friction, and were defeated by a majority of only 19 votes? Is it the same now as in the year 1883, when the first SPCC was formed in England? If you consider that human nature is still the same, you should instantly go out and make a bonfire of the works of Spencer, Darwin and Wallace, and then return to enjoy the purely jocular side of the present volume. If you admit that it has changed, let me ask you how it has changed, unless by the continual infinitesimal efforts upon themselves of individual men like you and me. Did you suppose it was changed by magic, or by acts of parliament, or by the action of groups on persons, and not of persons on groups? Let me tell you that human nature has changed since yesterday. Let me tell you that today reason has a more powerful voice in the directing of instinct than it had yesterday. Let me tell you that today the friction of the machines is less screechy and grinding than it was yesterday. You were born like that, and you can't alter yourself, and so it's no use talking. If you really believe this, why make any effort at all? Why not let the whole business beautifully slide and yield to your instincts? What object can there be in trying to control yourself in any manner whatever if you are unalterable? Assert yourself to be unalterable, and you assert yourself a fatalist. Assert yourself a fatalist, and you free yourself from all moral responsibility, and other people too. Well then, act up to your convictions, if convictions they are. If you can't alter yourself, I can't alter myself. And supposing that I come along and bash you on the head and steal your purse, you can't blame me. You can only, on recovering consciousness, affectionately grasp my hand and murmur, "Don't apologize, my dear fellow. We can't alter ourselves." This, you say, is absurd. It is. That is one of my innumerable points. The truth is, you do not really believe that you cannot alter yourself. What is the matter with you is just what is the matter with me. Sheer idleness. You hate getting up in the morning, and to excuse your inexcusable indolence, you talk big about fate. Just as patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel, so fatalism is the last refuge of a shirker. But you deceive no one, least of all yourself. You have not, rationally, a leg to stand on. At this juncture, because I have made you laugh, you consent to say, "I do try all I can, but I can only alter myself a very little. By constitution, I am mentally idle. I can't help that, can I?" Well, so long as you're not the only absolutely unchangeable thing in a universe of change, I don't mind. It is something for you to admit that you can alter yourself even a very little. The difference between our philosophies is now only a question of degree. In the application of any system of perfecting the machine, no two persons will succeed equally. From the disappointed tone of some of your criticisms, it might be fancied that I had advertised a system for making archangels out of tailors' dummies. Such was not my hope. I have no belief in miracles. But I know that when a thing is thoroughly well done, it often has the air of being a miracle. My sole aim is to insist that every man shall perfect his machine to the best of his powers, not to the best of somebody else's powers. I do not indulge in any hope that a man can be better than his best self. I am, however, convinced that every man fails to be his best self a great deal oftener than he need fail, for the reason that his willpower, be it great or small, is not directed according to the principles of common sense. Common sense will surely lead a man to ask the question, why did my actions yesterday contradict my reason? The reply to this question will nearly always be, because at the critical moment I forgot. The supreme explanation of the abortive results of so many efforts at self-alteration, the supreme explanation of our frequent miserable scurrying into a doctrine of fatalism, is simple forgetfulness. It is not force that we lack, but the skill to remember exactly what our reason would have us do or think at the moment itself. How is this skill to be acquired? It can only be acquired as skill at games is acquired, by practice, by the training of the organ involved to such a point that the organ acts rightly by instinct instead of wrongly by instinct. There are degrees of success in this procedure, but there is no such phenomenon as complete failure. Habits which increase friction can be replaced by habits which lessen friction. Habits which arrest development can be replaced by habits which encourage development. And as a habit is formed naturally, so it can be formed artificially by imitation of the unconscious process, by accustoming the brain to the new idea. Let give me as an example refer again to the minor subject of daily friction, and within that subject to the influence of tone. A man employs a frictional tone through habit. The frictional tone is an instinct with him. But if he had a quarter of an hour to reflect before speaking, and if during that quarter of an hour he could always listen to arguments against the frictional tone, his use of the frictional tone would rapidly diminish. His reason would conquer his instinct. As things are, his instinct conquers his reason by a surprise attack, by taking it unawares. Regular daily concentration of the brain for a certain period upon the non-frictional tone and the immense advantages of its use will gradually set up in the brain a new habit of thinking about the non-frictional tone, until at length the brain, disciplined, turns to the correct act before the old silly instinct can capture it, and ultimately a new sagacious instinct will supplant the old one. This is the rationale. It applies to all habits. Any person can test its efficiency in any habit. I care not whether he be of strong or weak will, he can test it. He will soon see the tremendous difference between merely making a good resolution — he has been doing that all his life without any very brilliant consequences — and concentrating the brain for a given time exclusively upon a good resolution. Concentration, the efficient mastery of the brain, all is there. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. The Brain as a Gentleman at Large. It is not as if in this business of daily living we were seriously hampered by ignorance, either as to the results which we ought to obtain, or as to the general means which we must employ in order to obtain them. With all our absorption in the mere preliminaries to living, and all our carelessness about living itself, we arrive pretty soon at a fairly accurate notion of what satisfactory living is, and we perceive with some clearness the methods necessary to success. I have pictured the man who wakes up in the middle of the night and sees the horrid semi-fiasco of his life. But let me picture the man who wakes up refreshed early on a fine summer morning and looks into his mind with the eyes of hope and experience, not experience and despair. That man will pass a delightful half hour in thinking upon the scheme of the universe as it affects himself. He is quite clear that contentment depends on his own acts, and that no power can prevent him from performing those acts. He plans everything out, and before he gets up, he knows precisely what he must and will do in certain foreseen crises and junctures. He sincerely desires to live efficiently. Who would wish to make a daily mess of existence? And he knows the way to realize the desire. And yet, mark me, that man will not have been an hour on his feet on this difficult earth before the machine has unmistakably gone wrong. The machine which was designed to do this work of living, which is capable of doing it thoroughly well, but which has not been put into order. What is the use of consulting the map of life and tracing the itinerary and getting the machine out of the shed and making a start, if half the nuts are loose, or the steering pillar is twisted, or there is no petrol in the tank? Having asked this question, I will drop the mechanico-vehicular comparison, which is too rough and crude for the delicacy of the subject. Where has the human machine gone wrong? It has gone wrong in the brain. What, is he wrong in the head? Most assuredly, most strictly. He knows, none better, that when his wife employs a particular tone containing 10 grains of asperity, and he replies in a particular tone containing 11 grains, the consequences will be explosive. He knows, on the other hand, that if he replies in a tone containing only one little drop of honey, the consequences may not be unworthy of two reasonable beings. He knows this. His brain is fully instructed. And lo, his brain, while arguing that women are really too absurd, as if that was the point, is sending down orders to the muscles of the throat and mouth, which result in at least 11 grains of asperity, and conjugal relations are endangered for the day. He didn't want to do it. His desire was not to do it. He despises himself for doing it. But his brain was not in working order. His brain ran away, raced on its own account, against reason, against desire, against morning resolves, and there he is. That is just one example of the simplest and slightest. Examples can be multiplied. The man may be a young man whose immediate future depends on his passing an examination which he is capable of passing on his head, which nothing can prevent him from passing, if only his brain will not be so absurd as to give orders to his legs to walk out of the house towards the tennis court instead of sending them upstairs to the study. If only, having once safely lodged him in the study, his brain will devote itself to the pages of books instead of dwelling on the image of a nice girl, not at all like other girls. Or the man may be an old man who will live in perfect comfort, if only his brain will not interminably run round and round in a circle of grievances, apprehensions, and fears which no amount of contemplation can destroy or even ameliorate. The brain, that is the seat of trouble. Well, you say, of course it is, we all know that. We don't act as if we did anyway. Give us more brains, Lord, ejaculated a great writer. Personally, I think he would have been wiser if he had asked first for the power to keep in order such brains as we have. We indubitably possess quite enough brains, quite as much as we can handle. The supreme muddlers of living are often people of quite remarkable intellectual faculty, with a quite remarkable gift of being wise for others. The pity is that our brains have a way of wandering, as it is politely called. Brain wandering is indeed now recognized as a specific disease. I wonder what you, oh businessman with an office in Ludgate Circus, would say to your office boy whom you had dispatched on an urgent message to Westminster and whom you found larking around Euston Station when you rushed to catch your weekend train. Please, sir, I started to go to Westminster, but there's something funny in my limbs that makes me go up all manner of streets. I can't help it, sir. Can't you? You would say. Well, you had better go and be somebody else's office boy. Your brain is something worse than that office boy, something more insidiously potent for evil. I conceive the brain of the average well-intentioned man as possessing the tricks and manners of one of those gentlemen at large who, having nothing very urgent to do, stroll along and offer their services gratis to some short-handed work of philanthropy. They will commonly demoralize and disorganize the business conduct of an affair in about a fortnight. They come when they like, they go when they like. Sometimes they are exceedingly industrious and obedient, but then there is an even chance that they will shirk and follow their own sweet will. And they mustn't be spoken to or pulled up, for have they not kindly volunteered, and are they not giving their days for naught? These persons are the bane of the enterprises in which they condescend to meddle. Now, there is a vast deal too much of the gentleman at large about one's brain. One's brain has no right whatever to behave as a gentleman at large, but it in fact does. It forgets. It flatly ignores orders. At the critical moment when pressure is highest, it simply lights a cigarette and goes out for a walk. and we meekly sit down under this behaviour. "I didn't feel like stewing," says the young man who, against his wish, will fail in his examination. "The words were out of my mouth before I knew it," says the husband whose wife is a woman. "I couldn't get any inspiration today," says the artist. "I can't resist, Stilton," says the fellow who is dying of greed. "One can't help one's thoughts," says the old warrior. And this last really voices the secret excuse of all five. And you all say to me, "My brain is myself. How can I alter myself? I was born like that." In the first place, you were not born like that. You have lapsed to that. And in the second place, your brain is not yourself. It is only a part of yourself, and not the highest seat of authority. Do you love your mother, wife, or children with your brain? Do you desire with your brain? Do you, in a word, ultimately and essentially live with your brain? No. Your brain is an instrument. The proof that it is an instrument lies in the fact that when extreme necessity urges, you can command your brain to do certain things, and it does them. The first of the two great principles which underlie the efficiency of the human machine is this: the brain is a servant, exterior to the central force of the ego. If it is out of control, the reason is not that it is uncontrollable, but merely that its discipline has been neglected. The brain can be trained as the hand and eye can be trained. It can be made as obedient as a sporting dog, and by similar methods. In the meantime, the indispensable preparation for brain discipline is to form the habit of regarding one's brain as an instrument exterior to one's self, like a tongue or a foot. End of chapter 3.